Good morning, everyone. At least all of you who are on East Coast U.S. time. Good afternoon for those of you in the Middle East, and good evening for everyone in those time zones as well. I'm Melinda McClimans. I'm the Assistant Director of the Middle East Studies Center at Ohio State University, and this is the Keys to Understanding the Middle East podcast. And today is a really special episode. I'm here with our lead intern, Rahma Anjum, and Professor Johanna Sellman of Near Eastern and South Asian Languages and Cultures here at Ohio State. And we're here to talk to you about Tutmania and a very unique opportunity to see Tutankhamun's actual, not the actual, but very, very high quality replicas of the artifacts from that tomb and the art. So I'm going to just hand it over to my guests to introduce themselves a little bit more and talk about why we're all here today.
Hi, this is Rahma Anjum. I'm working with the Middle East Studies Center, and when Dr. McClimans told me about the exhibit, I was very excited, and we started talking immediately about maybe doing like reviews of it, and we were very excited to have our professor of like migration literature and a lot to do with the Middle East come in and say that she'd already seen the exhibit and she was excited to talk about it. So when I originally visited, I was just taken aback by I guess when you enter with the darkened rooms and like the gold glimmering, and the religious imagery, it's impossible not to feel a little bit taken aback because it's just such a grand. It's not only the way that COSI had arranged it, but just the art that they had put together on this tomb and the significance that they had. Like it's it's such an incredible thing to have survived for so long and to have meant so much to people. And it really shows that it meant a lot because the craftsmanship is amazing. And I'll hand it off.
Hi, my name is Johanna Sellman, and I'm really excited to be here today. I saw the exhibit, I must have been end of April, beginning of May. I went, before I even knew that you all were doing this podcast, I went with a friend of mine who studied archaeology in Iraq, and we had such an interesting time at the exhibit that and we started having a conversation about it. And then when Melinda McClimans and Rahma Anjum reached out to have, to have this conversation, I was really interested because I felt like there was so much to talk about this exhibit. So I primarily teach and research modern Arabic literature. So I'm not an archaeologist, but I think there's so much linked to culture and literature, and especially modern Arabic literature that we could bring to this exhibit. One thing that really struck me, and honestly, after the exhibit, I learned a lot more about Tutmania, and especially the role of Tutmania in the United States and Europe than I knew before. And I think this exhibit is a really wonderful opportunity for us to think about the really dynamic relationship between the ancient past and the present. There's always kind of an ongoing reformulation of that relationship. I guess we're always making the ancient past mean new things. Mm-hmm. And the way that the ancient past starts meaning new things takes on different connotations in different places. So Tutmania in Europe and the United States was very different from, the impact that this discovery had in Egypt and the burgeoning Egyptian nationalism, for example. And I think the exhibit also offers us a really interesting opportunity to think about the role of ancient Egypt in both global culture and in modern Egyptian culture as well. So yeah, I'm excited to be here for the conversation.
Yeah, I'm personally Egyptian, and I've always found that there is kind of like a very separate vision of the ancient past. Mm-hmm. It's almost that people think of it. People in Egypt will think of it. It's a pride thing, but it's also separate. Mm-hmm. Like it's a separate stream that we can occasionally tap into. Yeah. But I definitely get the impression, at least from the people that I know, that it is like it is different culture. It is very held apart from us. I have always wondered if that's kind of the product of it being taken over so much by the Tutmania outside of Egypt, if it's like been claimed by others. It's almost like, Tutankhamun was never ours, or maybe he was taken to be somebody else's. Which kind of takes us to, I guess, the introduction to the story that COSI so brilliantly puts together. But I'm just going to give it to you. So, as many of you know, Tutankhamun was the last of his royal family line to rule in Egypt, ascending the throne at the age of 9 and ruling until 1324 BC. This is how he was known as the Child King. He died of, I think, malaria, like infections. They were found in his bone structure. In 1324 BC. At his time of rule, he was actually known for differing with religious reforms from his father, and so he was known as a bit of like I guess he was known his reputation was tainted, and so he was kind of disregarded by the following pharaohs, and some experts believe that this might have been why his grave was not robbed, because he was seen as like not being one of the most prestigious kings. This his tomb being completely intact is one of the main reasons it matters so much to us today, because along with, I guess, the grand story of the discovery, which COSI talks about as well. So the discovery almost starts a whole new stream. We'll call it Tutmania. It's not necessarily the king himself or ancient Egypt, but it's almost like a separate vision of it. So when you have Howard Carter, the archaeologist, discovering the tomb, or rather rediscovering the tomb in 1922, there's all these political things going on, including the colonized Egypt and Egyptian, I guess, bankruptcy of the local government. But part of this was the archaeology movement. They were searching for the tomb for a very long time, limited success. You'll find this all in COSI if you guys are able to visit. In 1922, he was able to find it astonishingly untouched. It was not robbed. It was not like discovered by other people before or after the burial and before the rediscovery by Howard Carter. So I would say that that's what kind of starts this. After that, it was definitely starting this massive interest in ancient Egypt, and like exhibits all over the world. And so I'd just like to start by talking about how the rediscovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, and this is a question for Professor Sellman. So how did Howard Carter's rediscovery of Tutankhamun's tomb give rise to new narratives about the place of ancient Egypt in culture and identity? As we know, it started a huge wave across the US and Great Britain. So we'd like to start, like, how did this actually change the identity of ancient Egypt?
Oh, this is such a great question. I just wanted to respond first to some of the things that you mentioned about ancient Egypt and Egypt being seen as both this kind of distinct thing from modern Egyptian culture, but also sometimes being seen as a link to a common identity. One thing that struck me when I was living in Egypt, I lived in Egypt twice because I was studying there. And the first time I lived in an area called Maadi. And one of the things that surprised me so much was that when I went into the apartment that I'd rented for the first time, I could see the pyramids from the window. Like, they were just part of the city landscape. And I think that's one thing I didn't realize about the Giza pyramids to begin with, was that they're just in the Giza city, they're just in the city and they're just part of the city landscape. And that there is this, as you mentioned, there is a sense that it was a very distinct from modern Egyptian culture and the religions that people currently belong to. But that often at some moments in Egyptian history, it has the ancient past has become a really important sense of a way to unify people and a way to kind of instill national pride. And what you mentioned also, I think, is really important, this debate about, that Tutankhamun's family was implicated in, about the religious orthodoxy, I guess. I don't know if you can call it orthodoxy of the ancient Egyptians. I think the heresy of his father that he was turning more to kind of a monotheistic, or he was saying that, well, only one of the gods is really the central god. And so I think this is one of the ways that people link to the past, either as depicting it as polytheistic and pre-monotheistic, pre-people of the book, all of these things. But then some people link kind of even monotheism to the ancient Egyptian past as well. So about how this discovery shaped this discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, how did this shape narratives about culture in various places? I mean, I think when we talk about Tutmania, when you look at information about Tutmania, sometimes we see a lot of examples from the role that the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb played in the West. And so you've probably seen examples of this. That there were films that were made, there was music, the Old King Tut, the hit song, and then even this is something that I didn't realize before. Even the 1920s flapper fashion was very inspired by Egyptian aesthetics, and I didn't realize that. But when I saw that, I was like, it really made sense. Kind of the angular haircuts, heavy eyeliner. I guess it was also in vogue to have kind of snake bracelets that were inspired by the jewels that were found in ancient Egyptian tombs. And so, in terms of what Tutmania meant in the United States and Europe, a lot of the things that we see are these kind of very pop culture phenomenon. This was a moment when mass media was becoming much more prevalent and widespread, and so these images could spread out very quickly. And then we have the mass media forms like cinema and cinema, starting to become more important. And so we have films like The Mummy that was made in 1932, and then we have also the particular moment that this came out, when this discovery was made. This is post Great War, post World War I. It was a time when a lot of people had lost a lot of, they had lost loved ones in the war, and there was maybe a fascination with a different approach to death, as well as maybe something that was marvelous and magnificent. Carter uses the word marvelous things, but something that was like extravagant and amazing and magnificent as a contrast to the war. This was also, a few years after the Great Flu pandemic. And so it was a moment when there are a lot of really difficult major events had taken place, and that this was maybe, I don't know if it was kind of a distraction, but it was a maybe something that was more awe-inspiring than some of the contemporary political events of the day. But then when we turn to, Rahma mentioned the question of who owns these artifacts, and mentioned this idea that in Egypt, that the sense of like, well, maybe the Europeans own them. And that's, I'm laughing not because it's a quite serious question, but also I'm laughing because there's some kind of an absurdity there that a lot of these artifacts from ancient Egypt are found currently in the British Museum, and that there are, this was not the first Tutmania, following the 1922 discovery of the tomb, was not the first kind of wave of great interest in ancient Egypt. This was, one of many waves. This is an area of history and of the world that had been fascinated for a long time. I mean, the Romans had a period of deep fascination with ancient Egypt, especially with its connection to ancient Greece. And then another really important moment, of course, is the moment following Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion of Egypt in 1798, and his really interesting decision to bring hundreds of scholars with him on this mission to colonize and conquer Egypt. And so this, when he brought these hundreds of scholars, or they called them savants, and they were there with the army, and they ended up producing, this massive work of scholarship, the description of Egypt in the early 19th century, when they were in Egypt. The army was, Bonaparte's army was presenting themselves as liberators, but really conquering Egypt. They brought these scholars, and they were also, retrieving artifacts and sending them to Europe. And because there was this rivalry at that point between Great Britain and France, that rivalry turned into, the Great Britain taking over the artifacts from the French. Like that, if we can imagine the colonial mindset where the rivalry was between two European powers, fighting it out over who's going to have the artifacts of this other country. We can understand that there is that narrative that Rahma was talking about, that maybe, the Europeans have taken these artifacts and they kind of own this history. And so it's not surprising that the ancient Egyptian past began to play such a major role in Egyptian nationalism of that period. So we can, I think we could definitely talk about the role that it played in Egypt as well. Do you want to get into that now, or do you want to talk about the narrative of the exhibit and then get into that?
I think it's so interesting. You mentioned, where can you find the artifacts today? I know repatriation is just such an obvious segue. It's such an important topic, but it's kind of also the solution is a little bit more on the obvious side. It's like, okay, we can give back artifacts, but it's also, there's much more than just the physical artifacts. How do you repatriate the narrative? How do we think about giving back the narrative? And I think that it's important to give a little bit more of the context of the narrative, at least the specific narrative in this little microcosm that's the COSI exhibit. And then maybe if we can work from there, and we can start with, okay, so how is this narrative presented? What else could we possibly do in order to think about repatriating the narrative?
Yeah. Well, maybe I could just say a few things about what a narrative is. Because I'm not an archaeologist, but I'm a professor of literature. So I think about narrative all the time. And I think narrative is actually quite useful for us to think about when we're thinking about this exhibit, and also the way that Tutmania took hold in different ways in different places. So, a narrative, on a basic level, a narrative is basically a telling of events. Sometimes it's a telling of a sequential series of events. Sometimes we say that a narrative is the relating of a story that has a beginning, middle, and an end. A narrative then, tells us what happened, who it happened to, when it happened, under what circumstances did it happen. And so narrative does, it does give us the facts of a story. But narratives are so powerful because they do a lot more than that. They do, narratives offer us kind of a framework, and sometimes an implicit, sometimes explicit map of social order. Usually narratives also answer questions about what is important, what values drive us, how do we live, what are the rules of living, what are good ways of living. And so we can often describe a story very factually, but then we can ask, what is the story really about? The story might tell us a lot about identity, culture, and politics. So I think one thing that we could say, and maybe just one more thing about a narrative, is that it's also important what a narrative doesn't say. And one of the things I'll say about this exhibit at COSI is that it's very strong. The narrative of this is an exhibit with an extremely strong narrative. For those of you who haven't been yet, and we want to say this is an amazing exhibit, you should go. But I think it's just good to have some tools for thinking about what kind of a narrative it is. It's an exhibit with an extremely strong narrative. You enter, you're given one of these little audio audio. They look like walkie-talkies. And you talk about a narrative as a sequence of events. You go through the narrative. When you get to exhibit number 1, you press button number 1, and it tells you the narrative. And the narrative of the exhibit is basically the narrative of Howard Carter. We watch a film in the beginning that begins with Howard Carter's childhood and his fascination with ancient Egypt, and the story of how he became interested in ancient Egypt, how he meets this, philanthropist and gets his mission to, search for Tutankhamun's tomb funded, his efforts to find the tomb, and then his discovery of the tomb. And then the next part of the exhibit is us walking in his footsteps. I mean, I think that's something to say, that this narrative really asks us to be in the place of Howard Carter, right? We walk in, and it's as if we are discovering the tomb in the same way that he discovered it. And so I think that's important to say, that this narrative has a very strong, this exhibit, I should say, has a very strong narrative. I don't know if you had a similar kind of reaction where you felt like, wow, this is like really taking you, it's like getting on a boat or something, and seeing, and there's kind of one path, one track to follow.
I think I definitely understand that when you have so much information to present, it's very convenient to find one angle with which to present it. I don't necessarily have a personal comment about the angle that they chose. It's very important, especially when maybe your audience is kids, like whoever your audience, it's very important to make sure that there are alternatives, because a narrative, I think by its definition, can only, like, it's impossible to give you all of the information of everything that ever happened. So it's always going to choose the most important things, as you said. But it's very important to understand that this is somebody choosing the most important things. These are not the most important things. Somebody choosing the truth. This is not necessarily everything that could ever be true. And so I think that if you add a little something to this and say that there was a lot more going on, yes, he discovered it, and yes, for his perspective, it was incredible. And from our perspective, it's incredible. That doesn't necessarily mean that's it. That's all. So just one small example, the fact that this grand king that's the most important to our culture right now was not seen as the grandest king. I mean, he was like, he kind of had a tainted reputation. So for other people, maybe this was cursed. That was another thing that they kind of talked about a little bit, like, this is cursed. And it's like, from whose perspective is it cursed? So I just think adding a little bit of, I don't want to say doubt to the narrative, definitely interest in looking beyond it, I think helps a lot.
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. And I think, I mean, to me, the best literary narratives are the ones that make us aware of narrative itself and give us choice, because they make us aware. And a lot of times the social values being conveyed in narrative are quite subtle and quite implicit, to the extent that we might not even notice them. And certainly if it's the only narratives that we're fed all the time, it makes it very difficult to get out of that narrative. So to me, the best literary narratives are the ones that allow us to see and to allow us to critique and allow us to see how narratives are constructed, or allow us to see multiple perspectives on them, and in that way give us a critical sensibility and also give us choice in terms of how to navigate that narrative. Apparently Howard Carter was a very prolific writer as well. I haven't read his diaries and his published works, but one thing that I understand about them is that he wasn't interested, this wasn't his area of interest, but he was also probably so immersed in a particular narrative about the importance of what he was doing that he didn't look to other possible narratives of what the discovery could mean. And so one thing I understand about his narratives is that he didn't write about what was happening in Egypt at the time. I mean, it's kind of incredible to think that 1922, the year that he discovered this tomb, or the year that we should say his team, because there were lots of people working on this, on this project. That's the same year that Egypt gains formal independence from Egypt. And, that's not, 1922 is, that the British control over Egypt continued until the 1950s, but 1922 is the year that when there's this formal recognition of independence that doesn't result in true independence, because the British troops are still there around the Suez Canal. The British are still really in control of the military and the economy over Sudan, which is part of Egypt as well. And so there's all this stuff going on in Egypt that's not mentioned in his that's not mentioned at all in his narrative. And it's not, it's not his job maybe to write a contemporary political history of Egypt, but these are major events. 1923, the year after, is when Egypt gets its first constitution, and the major events happening in terms of Egypt, Egyptian nationalism beginning to develop, Egypt making claims on political and cultural independence from Great Britain. And given this reality, it's not surprising that the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb also had a major impact on Egyptian culture and the way that Egyptians were formulating, a national identity at the same time. Mm-hmm. And this is something that we don't learn about in the exhibit, and which could be maybe something really interesting to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about the way that the discovery of Tutankhamun, again, like it, I don't know, I don't want to say it creates, but it definitely, it illuminates the fact that there exists a separate Egypt for those who have colonized Egypt. So for those who have colonized Egypt, there is our Egypt, that is completely separate from reality. And that's shown to the point that it's almost undeniable when you see how important this, like all this stuff in the dirt, is compared to the actual people and the things that they're actually doing. And I just think that that's to understand that the way that we talk about sometimes these other cultures comes from a legacy of talking about other cultures in a light that's separate from their reality, in order to, I want to say, I guess, push our vision of what they are, what they ought to be, what's important about them to us. And so ancient Egypt, the importance of ancient Egypt, even over recent Egypt, and the very important things that had been happening around that time, is another tool that may have been used to I guess deprive some people of their actual agency. So I don't know how much time we have to talk about the O word of Orientalism, but I do think that it kind of fits in pretty well here. So if we could just talk. Okay, awesome.
That's a good topic.
How we view people's agency, especially in the Orient, versus sort of people being passive in the Orient, not necessarily claiming their own narratives or being actors in their own stories, versus the people who are more dominant. They have agency and they can decide which stories are important. I would love if you could talk a little bit about that, Professor Sellman. Just define it.
Yeah, I think it's such a big question and such an important question. And I think one of the things that we deal with when it comes to ancient Egypt and then the more modern contemporary Middle East is that ancient Egypt, I think for a long time, was really folded into the idea of Western civilization, seen as one of the roots of Western civilization in a way that's very distinct from the way that Orientalist perspectives depict the Middle East. And so, Egypt plays obviously a really important role in the Bible, the close relationship to Greek civilization. There's all these ways that Egypt for a long time has been seen, ancient Egypt, I should say, has been seen as part and parcel of the idea of Western civilization, at least like one of the roots or one of the linked cultures. And with Orientalism, I mean, maybe we could, some people listening might be familiar with the idea. I mean, Orientalism, when we say Orientalism, it goes back to this kind of system of thought that categorizes the West as kind of having a unifying system of beliefs, ways of being historical, versus the Orient or the East having a radically different ways of of being, system of beliefs, and these kinds of things. And so Orientalism, the term was coined by a Palestinian American scholar, Edward Said, who wrote the book in 1978, or published the book in 1978, I should say, and really put a name to a way of seeing the East that had been prevalent for so long in Western scholarship, attitudes, colonial missions, ways of writing history. And it really points to this binary way of thinking, of seeing the East as diametrically opposed to the West, as two very distinct parts of the world that have these very opposite ways of being. And I think we're familiar with some of the stereotypes about Orientalism. Rahma, you mentioned the idea of the East being seen as timeless, ahistorical, lacking agency. And so these are some of, sometimes when we talk about Orientalism, it's also about exotification, seeing the East as mystical, but lacking kind of a rationality, lacking agency, lacking a sense of historical agency as well. And so it's easy to see how this way of thinking about a part of the world can justify these kinds of colonial missions that like Napoleon Bonaparte was a part of, and that Howard Carter was very immersed in as well, seeing that these locals, they can kind of provide interesting raw material for our study, but they're not active agents. Like they weren't taking into account like Arabic language scholarship on ancient Egypt, or this, and it gives justification to like the idea that we need to take these artifacts, or we need to colonize this place, and because they can't quite run their own show, or they can't quite take care of their own antiquities. And one thing that so when Edward Said, when he talked about the reason why he wrote Orientalism, he gets back to this idea of narrative, because he said that one of the reasons he wrote Orientalism, because he is an Arab, as a Palestinian, he said he kept encountering in film and in literature and art, all of these ways of depicting the so-called East that he, as somebody who came from that region of the world, just couldn't recognize. He was like, this is a different place they're talking about than the place that I'm from. And so that's really when he started seeing that discrepancy, is when he started systematizing this as a kind of ideology that justifies colonization, military intervention, a sense of Western superiority, all of these things, that there's a whole system of thought that underpins these very material realities in the world, like military interventions and so on. And so he talks a lot about narrative, the idea that when he said, when he was reading about accounts of the so-called East from writers, from travel narratives and so on, he noticed that they were really writing about the same thing, that they were more like quoting each other rather than engaging with the actual place. And I think that's one of the real power, that I think it's a testament to the real power of narrative, that that narratives really, even if we've never been to a place, it can shape our understanding of that place. Even if we go to that place and we've already been immersed in all of those narratives, it shapes the way that we see the place. Like we might even rely more on the narratives than our actual experience of seeing the place. So Yes, I think that the Orientalist perspective is really important, and the fact that the fact that it was kind of a given for Howard Carter, it seems that, and maybe for the discipline of archaeology. I'm not an archaeologist, I probably shouldn't speak for the discipline of archaeology, but it was kind of a given that these artifacts, could be discovered, and
there is a like a strand in archaeology. I learned this from the director of our center, who is an archaeologist.
Yeah.
There is a strand to decolonize archaeology, in a sense, like just to counter what you're saying. So that's absolutely valid. You don't have to be an archaeologist. There is an effort toward that in archaeology.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting and so important, and certainly there, I think that, archaeology that's being done today, I imagine, is quite different than the one, the ideas of archaeology around Howard Carter's time as well.
Mm-hmm. I just find that that's what you said about when you're representing or when you're talking about something and representing something, it's very important to see, are you like, what are you actually representing? Because it's almost like you're just repeating the story that's been told to you many, many times, and that's completely normal. Like that's just a very human instinct, I'd find. Like if you expect that somebody will be a certain way, that's what you'll see in the smallest example, but also in a much bigger scale.
Yeah.
That's extremely prevalent. And it's, as I also read with like about the book Colonizing Egypt for Timothy Mitchell, he writes about the kind of the act of, I think it's separating representations from the real world, and the way that the exhibition, or just the perception of people who go to these exhibitions, they are perceiving a world that doesn't actually exist, and it's actually very comfortable that way, because it's almost like you own it, you know how it's supposed to go, like know how this story is supposed to go, and you know what ancient Egypt is supposed to feel like. But
that
what is it?
So interesting to me, based on having taken students to Egypt.
Really?
On study abroad, yeah, we took 50 students to Egypt many years ago for a spring break trip, and there was like a range of reactions. They had all studied about Egypt, so they were, I think, probably more anti-Orientalistic than the typical tourist, I hope, I think some of our tour guides are actually surprised that they were asking informed questions sometimes, which was great. But there was a range. I mean, I think some students really clinged to their representations, or like what you said earlier it really hit me, like seeing what you want to see, like continuing to see what you want to see, like almost seeking, it's like an unconscious seeking of the same images you've seen in books, like right around you, like, and then the tourism plays into that too. They then perform those for you, on the Nile cruises, they'll have like dervishes and belly dancers and all kinds of orientalized versions of actual native culture, and stuff like that. So that's really interesting, to think about, like, especially for this exhibit, when it's here in Columbus, so please do check it out. But to think about, what we have to unlearn before going into the exhibit, or maybe how different people will come to it, will experience it completely differently depending on where they're coming from. Thank you so much. So please go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, absolutely. That was a great example. That's exactly what I mean. It's I don't think it's exactly the ways of seeing John Berger, but it's definitely the way that you perceive things, and then the way that it's like re-fed into you, the same thing that you think you're meant to see.
And it's really hard to get out of our narratives. I mean, that's just how powerful they are. And I think maybe something that we could mention about the exhibit too, and one of the reasons it can be such a pleasure to immerse yourself in that narrative, is that there's just the sense of awe that you might experience when it comes to, seeing these objects made of gold and and of incredible beauty. That's something that we were talking about. I was there with a friend who studied archaeology, ancient archaeology in Mesopotamia, and we were talking about how incredible it is to confront and to be immersed in art that's several thousand years old, in this case about 3,000 years old, and just be awed by the beauty and that there was something with Egyptian art. There's something about the simplicity of the form and the lines and the balance of the figures and the intriguing figures that we do see, these mixes between human and animal, and just the sense of balance and harmony that we might experience in these works of art. It's kind of, on that level, it's kind of amazing that we can still experience these things as beautiful and aesthetically pleasing, not just impressive because there's so much gold and it's so big and it's so impressive how they built this. That on one level is incredible as well. But just a sense of beauty in it as well.
I also find, I don't know if there's necessarily a universality, but just like seeing that their design principles, their symmetry, as you said, their balance, use of space is still so visually pleasing today. Like when you take a graphic design class, like you learn about these things and it's like, okay, yeah, they knew it. They also did. That's just kind of what works. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and certainly giving credit where credit is due is something that is neglected in these spaces. I'm just going to say, like getting the local perspectives more prominently a part of what we're experiencing. And that kind of brings me to a question I wanted to make sure we made some time for, which was about the ethics of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And you had experienced this exhibit with a colleague from Iraq who has, personal experience with being an Iraqi with immense knowledge of antiquities of Iraq, and that experience of, I don't know, the struggles with agency within the field of archaeology because of these legacies. What can you tell us about your research, or maybe just research in general? What are the ethics to be aware of when we're looking at antiquities of Egypt or any other country?
Well, I think that, one thing that we experienced being at the exhibit was both, I'd say both this dual sense of wonder and this sense of wait, are they going to get to another perspective at a certain point? We're still with Howard Carter, when this film, it was just a sense of oh, more Howard Carter, interesting, and it's an interesting story, and it's a story that kids can get into, especially kids visiting the exhibit. But it seems like there could be lots of opportunity of introducing really fascinating alternate perspectives. And to me, that's one of the most important aspects of ethics, especially when it comes to narratives. I think one of the big ethical questions to me, ethics is really about the recognition of the other, not just the other in terms of culture being formulated as other, but ethics is really about the recognition of the agency, the vulnerability, the full humanity, the full dignity of the other. And so asking ourselves, to what extent is that being achieved in our research? To what extent is that being achieved in the narrative that we're presenting? To what extent are we cultivating an awareness of multiple ways of seeing this narrative? To what extent are we cultivating an awareness of how this narrative is constructed, and by virtue of how it's being constructed, what are the implicit assumptions? What are whose narrative is not being part of this narrative? Why was that left out? And so to me, one of the big questions about ethics is that, we can't ever maybe quite fully achieve it, that full, complete responsibility and recognition of the full dimensionality of the other. But I think it's something we can continually strive for. And then also cultivating a curiosity about the narrative, about, as I mentioned, what's being left out, what's the story behind the story that's being told, and is that the only possible way of formulating this narrative? Why was this particular narrative told? And I think, I think this, asking ourselves in this context too, how could this one event, this really important discovery in archaeology, how maybe it signifies really differently in different contexts. We got the story of Howard Carter, but maybe it might make us curious about what did it mean for Egyptians? What did it mean for, kind of elite literary culture? What did it mean for the people living in that area? What did it mean for the people working on the site? These are all the kinds of questions we could ask us when it comes to sort of thinking about this question from an ethical perspective. Yeah, and Rahma, I'd love to hear from you too, because you're studying history and literature, which are in the story. These are really disciplines that deal with narrative, in a really central way.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you said that. I've like this entire time, I think one of the books that I read that most like shaped the way that I view history is Minor Detail by Adiana Shibli, and it is about Palestine. But just thinking about what are the harms of unethical scholarship.
Yeah.
And I think that that's so important to say, because it really seems like, what's wrong with generalizations? Like, it's easier, like, for me to just think like to have a map of the world and being like, oh, this place has pyramids, this place has this place has boats. Like, but who does that actually harm?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think once you actually understand that it does have real harms, then you can start to view it in a very different way, which is essentially when we have these generalizations that are not necessarily informed by the specificity of the real thing and are not necessarily interacting with the actual agents that it impacts, like let's say Egyptians today, Egyptian government, the Egyptian narrative, the things that are very much related, that are part of it, whether we like it or not, for Tutmania, then we start to have this completely separate, almost like this completely separate narrative that's actually fake, and we keep contributing to it because maybe it makes us more comfortable, but that it's not only does it sometimes when it gets out of order, it can lead to erasure. There's the erasing of the actual implications that makes it so that this scholarship is it's not doing the thing that scholarship is supposed to do. And I think that's essentially, that's the end of the day. Like, what is our scholarship trying to achieve? Are we actually trying to learn about people? Are we actually trying to connect? Or are we going to keep going to this same big narrative, the not minor detail, but the major detail, I guess. Not major detail, because then it's not a detail. The big picture. Are we going to keep contributing to the big picture, or are we going to try to edit it? And are we always going to be trying to like look deeper beyond it, find the little details that might not fit in, but are still true? They're very much true, even if they don't fit our picture. So that's kind of like a lot. You find that somewhere else, but I think that shows why this ethical scholarship and really looking deeper is so important. And it, I guess, gives more power to the real things that are happening, especially today.
I love that you brought up Minor Detail, because I think that is such a brilliant reflection on how history is told, among many other things. But one of the things that's so powerful about that book is the focus on silence, and that sometimes the actual history can be found in those moments of silence, or at least those moments of silence can evoke curiosity about what's missing. Why is that voice missing? Why is that story missing? And also understanding, I think one of the things that's really powerful about that book is the way that it really calls attention to the way that some narratives and some voices are much more linked to power than others. And that doesn't necessarily mean that those voices just because they're louder or are backed by a more powerful narrative, powerful in the sense of being linked to these structures of power in our society. That doesn't make them necessarily more true. And so I think that's something that we could think about in the terms of the silences of this really interesting narrative and really interesting exhibit. But maybe get us curious about what's not being told.
The thing about those silences, as far as I know, there's a lot less told from certain perspectives than there is others, or rather, there's a lot less recorded. There's a lot less kept in museums, a lot less kept in libraries, from maybe locals, than from British archaeologists. So it really is that when you do look deeper, I imagine that there is a lot of silence. There are a lot of like gaps that are very tempting to fill with your preconceived assumptions. And I think that's why like accepting that silence and having respect for it, and the reason that it's there is so critical, because it's going to be there. That's just kind of how preservation has happened. There's some things that don't need to be preserved, or some things people don't preserve. I think, yeah. I think the other thing that I was just thinking about is so important about the book, minor detail, not to keep going back, but the thing that really shaped it was the living history, because you'll find at the end, one of the solutions is people are still here today. Like we still have parts of the land and the narrative today to turn to. So maybe the more important thing than looking so far into the past is seeing the present, and really trying to connect it to the present, and trying to view the present in light of it and view it in light of the present. And I think that that's something that is missing, which is what does the history mean to the Egyptian people today? Because they're actually there. A lot of them are there. A lot of them do study this. A lot of them have opinions and papers. And they research this. So it's not necessarily a silence. But it maybe is, there's a language barrier. But yeah, I don't know if you have time, but I'd love to talk about like connecting it to sort of outreach efforts in the region. And instead of just talking about ancient Egypt, which is a great way to start, how do we talk about what's related to it today? Maybe not just modern Egypt, but also people in Sudan, also archaeology efforts today.
That's a great question. I mean, I think one of the things, when we think about Tutmania, maybe, we could be curious about what was Tutmania like in Egypt? Because I think if you were to look up Tutmania, you would get lots of really interesting and cool examples about music and film and literature made in Europe and the United States. But it really also misses the way that this impact had such a huge impact on Egyptian cultural production as well. And we don't see as much of that. Part of it has to do with the question of translation, that, everything doesn't get translated and doesn't become available. But it's a really interesting phenomenon how this discovery really shaped Egyptian political, national, literary culture of the time, and really continues to, and as an example, like in the revolution of 1919, the revolution against the British, there was very little references to ancient Egypt. But after this discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in the 1920s and 1930s, the way that Egyptian nationalism was formulated was just rife with references to Tutankhamun, to mummies, to ancient Egypt. And maybe it's that, the ancient past in some ways quite convenient in many ways, because it doesn't talk back to you. It doesn't tell you, it can be reshaped in so many different ways, and it doesn't take positions necessarily in contemporary divisions of identity and culture. So it was a very convenient way and very powerful way to unify a nation, to look at this national past and in a way that transcends, religion, Christian, Muslim, transcends social class, transcends, but it's locally specific. It's not simply Arabic or Islamic, for example, in terms of the other nationalisms that are around, but it was very specific to Egypt. So and this is one of the ways I think we could, when we think even about Tutmania, we could be curious, what was the Egyptian Tutmania? It was very different, but it was very prevalent and very creative, and lots of people writing novels about ancient Egypt, writing poetry, even trying to use pharaonic motifs and I think poetic structure as well. I mean, really, really trying to make use of this ancient history to make a claim about unity of a nation. So I don't know. I was thinking that's one way, like thinking about Tasmania.
I think that reinforces the fact that it's not a dead culture.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like that's one of those. It's not exactly a stereotype, but I'll call it a stereotype. Like that, there's certain communities that are part of like a culture that is, I don't even like to use the word dead, but like, it's just relegated to the past. That's really strong. And in fact, there is native knowledge of pharaonic culture from themselves. Like there's still the language still used in the Coptic church, in the liturgy, and there's still, those I think culture is not recognized for how strong it really is, like how much it can really carry down through generations.
Yeah.
Even if the language changes and the religion changes, it doesn't entirely go away. It's still there. And I think that is so important to eventually, it's hard to realize if you're not a part of the culture, but I think it's an important aspect. So we only have like 5 more minutes though. So is there anything else you want to say about any of the things we've talked about?
Well, I would love to add some resources to the page. So I'd encourage any listeners to look out for that.
Yes.
Yeah. So we have library resources. Our library director at Ohio State has recommended a lot to us, Mekdal Sherbini, and we'd love to share it with you.
Yeah. And Dr. Sellman, what courses are you offering this autumn? Because we might have students watching who'd be really interested to learn more from you.
Oh, wonderful. I am, in the autumn, I'm teaching a class on Arabic migration, literature, and film. And that's actually the only class I'm teaching in the autumn. And Rahma was in that class.
I would recommend.
Yes, so
definitely.
You're very welcome to come to that class. And maybe I could just add just how, that there's such incredible continuity in culture, but just at the same time, such incredible malleability. The fact that we're debating who's going to play Cleopatra, and just shows how these debates continue. The Moon Knight, that Marvel show. I mean, ancient Egyptian history and culture continue to be debated, and also being a really productive site of kind of identity and creativity, and it continues to be really both a contested but also very creative and productive site of imagining the ancient past, of marvel and awe, but also of politics and cultural identity. So it's very much alive.
Yeah.
I'm actually wondering, on the podcast site, is there a place for comments? Because I feel like I remember there might be.
The podcast site, you mean like YouTube?
It's like a website, the Keys to Understanding the Middle East website.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, I was thinking of a million different things. Yeah, absolutely. There's comments there. Sometimes I get some comments there. It comes to me as an email. So that'd be exciting to get one that wasn't spam. So yes.
Yeah, no, if anybody went to the exhibit either before this or because of this, it would be awesome to get your input on what you noticed from the exhibit. That would be amazing. But
so interesting. Yeah. And really, go to the exhibit if you have a chance.
For sure, for sure. And then any projects either of you are working on right now you're excited about, you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, I'm writing some kind of a piece of reference work on exile literature right now. I just recently published a book on Arabic exile literature in Europe, and so I'm right now writing a reference, probably with a focus on Palestinian refugee and exile literature, and working on some translation. And Rahma, you have many projects, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I've been looking into a lot, been trying to connect with people about this. It's actually similar. I found that this what I've been looking at for this like Egyptian Tutmania is very related. I'm just kind of talking about food culture, and the way that specificity can be taken away in order to achieve certain ends versus kind of like giving the actual customs that are behind food, the actual people, the actual history, the actual like methods of preparing,
Nice.
and the power of that specificity versus the danger of, I guess, taking it away and either putting it under an umbrella term or just stripping it from its context of its past. And I guess stemming from that, thinking about like appropriation versus appreciation of food and culture.
Interesting.
Yeah, so my main, like, I found my claim would be specificity has a very important power, and taking it away has an erasing power as well. So
That's
yeah.
so interesting.
So where can we find these projects? Do you know, do you want to share? People might be interested.
Yeah, so definitely keep posted on the Middle East Studies Center blog for a blog post about food culture. And in the future, in I think September, we won't be hosting, but Ohio State will have a screening of a film by what is it, Jumana Menna?
Manan?
Yes, about also food culture. I don't think it's necessarily about food appropriation, but it's definitely about the importance of the way that food is prepared and how that has wide cultural significance. It's called
September 18th,
Foragers.
mark your calendars. It's a Sunday, it's at the Wexner Center for the Arts. It's called Foragers.
Yes, definitely go.
Super excited. Yeah, because the director will be on campus. Not at that time. She'll be on campus earlier in August. So check our website or get in contact with me, and I'll make sure you get notifications. So, all right.
And I think when it comes to the excerpts, the pieces of research that Magda Eshebini is sharing, a lot of them are open access, like the really wonderful book that Rahma, you recommended, that you found, that Elliot Kohler wrote on conflicted antiquities in Egypt. That one is available through Knowledge Unlatched, and so it's a book that's available open access.
Also the OSU library.
Yeah, and I was thinking if people have access to the OSU libraries, that's wonderful. And I think, a lot of scholars, myself included, are doing our utmost to publish also open access, to make it available to, make this kind of scholarly work available to anybody in the world with an internet connection who wants to access them. So I think a lot of the resources that Magda Eshebini prepared are actually open access. You can access them just from their website, or from the website that we're sharing.
I will include links in the show notes to these things, so everyone can find them. Anything else? Dr. Sellman, where are you going to be sharing your current project? Is there any way we can catch what you're working on somewhere else?
That one the current project is going to be published through Cambridge. I'm not sure what the I'm not sure what the open access status is, but it would be available through OSU libraries. The book I published last year is available also through Knowledge Unlatched, and so that one it's on Arabic migration literature in Europe, specifically 21st century, so relatively recent narratives of migration, also confronting a lot of pre-existing narratives about migration and showing how literature can allow us new perspectives on an issue that has been so central to ideas about culture and politics recently. So that one's available open access
Awesome.
through Knowledge Unlatched as well.
Amazing, amazing. Great follow-ups, I think, for people who are interested in changing their narratives. So thank you both so much for a really interesting and substantive conversation. I love learning more about your knowledge and experience with these things. And thanks to our audience. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Bye.